Let's start with reading. One thing you might notice when you get your course outlines next week is that university courses involve a lot of reading. At yesterday's workshop, we talked about how one of the big differences between high school and university is the amount of reading. Over time, you'll learn how to set priorities. You'll determine which readings require a lot of time and which require less. You'll learn to read in different ways, sometimes closely, trying to understand a source in depth and to retain the details, and sometimes spending less time skimming for main ideas or relevant ideas. When you're writing papers, you can approach reading your sources in a similar way. You can adjust the amount of time you spend reading each one and the depth to which you try to understand each source based on the requirements of your assignment. This is what many experienced university students do to help manage their time. As shown on this slide, some writing assignments ask students to understand and analyze what an author is saying or doing in one particular text. Students are expected to understand that source in depth. Other writing assignments ask students to find answers to a question or a set of questions using multiple sources. What's important is to start early and adjust your approach to reading depending on the purpose of the assignment, depending on what the assignment asks you to do. If I could give first-year students one suggestion about writing university papers, I think it would be about reading. It would be this. Spend lots of time reading before you write. Allocate time to learn deeply, focusing your reading around the questions in your writing assignment. Let's look more closely at that first point where you're asked to analyze what an author is saying or doing in one particular text. This is sometimes the case with assignments in first-year history courses, where you might write about the significance of one document, such as a historical letter or journal entry. It could also be the case in first-year English courses, where you might look at how a theme or a device works in a novel or a short story. This is the case in many other disciplines as well, that you might be asked to look at one source in depth. If your assignment asks you to write about what an author is saying in one particular text, if at all possible, try to read that text at least a couple of times, approaching it in different ways. This will give you the depth of understanding you need to address your assignment question. When you read the text for the first time, you can get an overall sense of what it's about. The second reading can go much faster. Here you can look for the details or the examples that are relevant to your assignment question. Reading with your assignment question in mind, you can highlight the relevant details. I would also strongly suggest turning these highlighted chunks into your own bullet point notes. We'll talk about note-taking a little bit later. If the reading is short, you could even consider reading it a third time. Just maybe think about how the example or the specific points that you highlighted contribute back to the overall meaning of the work. This ensures that you can describe the relevant details, but you can go farther. You can explain how the details contribute to larger meanings. How are they significant? We'll look at this process in the context of a writing assignment. This example writing assignment comes from our workshop yesterday. Don't worry, it's just an example assignment. You don't have to do this assignment. We're just going to look at it for a minute. So here's the writing assignment. Discuss magic realism in Isabella Allende's book, The Stories of Eva Luna. If I were approaching this guideline, ideally I'd read this book twice. Once to get a sense of the storyline and the characters, and then a second time to pull out examples of magic realism. Because my source is a book, and it's about 300 pages, my second reading would look a lot more like skimming, where I'm reading quickly, looking for, and highlighting relevant examples based on the assignment questions. As I read, I would take notes that list these examples. These notes would allow me to study or analyze the examples of magic realism altogether listed in one place. From there, I could begin to consider bigger questions like how and why does the Yende use magic realism? What is its significance? Moving from examples to questions of significance, I'm moving towards the argument for my paper. The process I just described for reading and note-taking accounts for both the length of my source and is based around the assignment question. So before we look at reading multiple sources based on a set of questions, Pearl, are there one or two questions coming from the chat or comments that you'd like to share with us?
No, it doesn't seem so.
Okay.
But you might want to mention something briefly about time management in this part, because especially for reading a long book, it can take a lot to manage the time there.
Yes, it can. And so again here, it's really important to have that guideline early. Really spread out this process as much as you can. If you think back, if you were at yesterday's workshop, think back to that calendar that Natalie showed that broke down the assignment guideline. Student writer would start very early. The other thing is if you are crunched with a bunch of assignments from different courses, you might have to condense this process in order to manage your time. You might be only able to read this source once, and so you'd be reading for overall meaning at the same time as highlighting the relevant examples. So if you think, like, there's no way I could look at this book twice, you're going to want to condense this process and read with the assignment question in mind right from the start. That would help you use your time even more efficiently. Does that sort of address it, Coral?
Yes, and another brief question we're getting is, how many times is too many times to reread something, or is there too many times to reread something?
That's a question, because it is possible to overthink things, right? And you do have to balance one assignment with everything else you're doing as a student. Maybe you also have a job, other family responsibilities. And so it's all a matter of balance, but just in terms of the assignment itself, I think if you're reading with a focus and you're pulling out the relevant details, you will want to move along in the reading and writing process so that you give yourself plenty of time to write your draft, maybe meet with a writing tutor to get some feedback on it, and time to revise your draft as well. So, you know, you can think about, some people talk about the first 40% of the process, writing up another 20 or 30%, and then revising at another 30%. So give yourself lots of revision time too. Does that get at it, Cora?
Your audio is breaking out a little bit there, Kathy. Can you, I think it started breaking out right about the time before you started breaking it up percentage-wise.
Okay, thanks, Coral. Yeah, so some people talk about the reading and writing process as, you know, reading is about 30 or 40% of the whole process. Writing your draft is about 30%, 20 or 30%, and then the time to revise is about 30% or so. So you want to break down that process so that you give every step sort of ample time. Is that better, Coral?
Yes, thanks, Kathy.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Vicki now.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. So now we're looking at the second one. So sometimes you'll be more focused on a question or set of questions than on analyzing a particular text. This will be the case when you're asked to write a research paper using multiple sources. Sometimes these sources will be given to you in an assignment, and sometimes you'll be asked to find them yourself. When you're asked to find sources yourself, skimming becomes even more important. You'll take a quick look at many sources and use this quick look to decide which ones will help you in your assignment. You'll probably read the abstract, also known as a summary, of the article, and maybe the introduction to see if the source is useful, and then make your decision of whether or not you're going to use that source. Even when you've found your sources, you may use some skimming strategies, reading quickly over parts that don't directly address your research question, and focusing in on those parts that do. Make sure, though, that when you take information from a source, you have at least a general understanding of what the author is trying to do in their text, so that you don't take an idea out of context and misrepresent the author in how they're using the idea. In other words, when you use multiple sources in a research paper, you should have a sense of the purpose and main idea of each source you're bringing in. Next slide, please. So here's another example assignment. It's quite a lot of text on the screen, so I'm going to read through the entire assignment first. So this example assignment focuses on climate change in Canada. Select an article from a scholarly journal that discusses the effects of climate change in the Canadian context. In approximately 250 words, summarize the main points raised by the authors about the effects of climate change. Then in approximately 500 words, provide your own evaluation of these points. Use at least 2 additional peer-reviewed articles to support your evaluation. Your paper should be organized as an essay with a brief introduction that provides your reader with a roadmap of the paper. Do not include a hook. The body paragraph should be focused and well organized, and your essay with a conclusion that brings together your main points. So as you can see, this assignment focused on climate change. And as I was reading it, maybe you thought it looked very intimidating because you are being asked to follow a lot of different instructions. For those of you who attended yesterday, you may have learned a little bit about assignment guidelines, such as discussing timeline, outline, and what you're being asked to do. In addition to basic information about your assignments, these guidelines are also incredibly helpful in letting you know more about how to read for a specific assignment. So next slide, please. So, for example, in contrast to the assignment guidelines Kathy just shared about the Ava Luna book, this assignment has a lot more detail. Guidelines can vary a lot from one assignment to the next or one course to the next. However, one thing that I find helpful with a longer guideline is to highlight the most relevant pieces. In terms of knowing more about what you need to read, there are 2 pieces that are very important here. So one, in an article you select, you will summarize the main points raised by the author or authors about climate change. The word summarize lets you know that you will need to read the entire work and be able to condense the ideas expressed by the authors. Next slide, please. So the second part of the assignment guidelines that helps guide your reading is the part highlighted here in green, asking you to provide your own evaluation of these points. Use at least 2 additional peer-reviewed articles to support your evaluation. Here you are being asked to use 2 additional sources for your reading that you will get to choose. These sources will help you respond to what is being said in the original article and support what you are trying to say, similar to if you were telling a story about events in your life and you have 2 people who can confirm those details are accurate because they were there with you. So your story would carry more weight because these people can support your claims. Similar to how finding additional articles that talk about the same themes, in this example climate change, can help support your original article and the claims it may be making. Next slide, please. So we've just talked about climate change. Many students I've worked with find it pretty straightforward to find an article on this topic because it's very popular and trendy right now and is being looked at by many different people in different fields. However, what students seem to struggle with more is after they found an article. What do they do with it? How do they actually read it? One of the most important steps is to give yourself more time to read. When you're reading a scholarly or peer-reviewed article, which is an article written by academic community, like researchers who are approved experts in that field of study, so in our case, climate change experts, and other sources that are likely brand new to you, it's important to give yourself extra time. This is not because you are not smart enough to understand, but because reading these new types of sources is a learning process. There may be concepts you haven't seen before or a writing style that's not familiar to you. It may take longer to read something that looks so different. The purpose of reading here is also different. In university, reading is needed to do well on your assignment and write a paper that shows you understand the ideas being expressed in those readings. It's more strategic and not the same as flipping through a magazine or a book that you have read for fun. Making meaning is important with readings because you'll likely incorporate them into bigger assignments, like the assignment guidelines we've looked at so far. You may take notes or write down questions as you read. All of this takes time and is very much a learning process. Next slide, please. So what if you don't understand what you're reading? This is a question that comes up from students all the time, so you are definitely not alone. As we talked about on the last slide, it's completely normal to find it tough to understand scholarly works, especially when it's the first time you start reading them. No one will ever be an expert on all things, so be patient with yourself as a learner and ask for help when you need it. The more that you start reading outside of your comfort zone, the more you will start to understand. Over time, sources that you may have never seen before, such as peer-reviewed articles, will start to look more familiar in their structure, characteristics. And as a student creator of assignments, you'll start to know what to look for. If you still need help, that's completely normal. And don't be afraid to ask your instructors, professors, librarians, writing tutors to help you and engage with the strategies. Next slide, please. So one of the best strategies to use when you're having trouble reading is to incorporate background information. This can look differently depending on what is challenging about the reading and what other materials you have access to. If you have a textbook for the course, this is a great resource for getting definitions or reading more in depth about a concept. You can look in 2 areas of the textbook, the front and the back of the book, to find out where to get the information. The front of the book includes a table of contents, which lists out the chapters or important headings of information. The back of the book includes index, where you can search for a term alphabetically, maybe climate change, and it will tell you which pages that word can be found in the textbook. Google searches are also good for getting fast information on a new topic. A quick definition, an overview of something. Google is not normally considered the best source on many assignments that you will write in your university, especially if they're asking for peer-reviewed sources. But that doesn't mean you can't use it to help you better understand what is being discussed in the articles, textbooks, or other sources you're using in your course. Finally, looking at other sources, where they are scholarly, like articles you can find through the library, or non-scholarly, like a blog you may have found through Google, can be useful to give you a more holistic view of a topic, meaning you understand it better by seeing how many different people are talking about it and what their views are. So I'll pass it back to Kathy now to take us through taking notes while you read.
Okay, thanks, Vicki. We're going to shift gears a little bit here, and we're going to get really practical and start talking about note-taking and then paraphrasing. But before we do, Coral, are there any comments or questions coming up in the chat related to reading?
One thing that is coming up a bit is what exactly is a peer-reviewed source?
Really good question. Vicki, do you want to take that?
Sure. Peer-reviewed source question I get very often from students. And those are sources where not only the expert in that area has written the source, but other experts in the same area have read those sources and given feedback. So they may have suggested things that the original researcher needs to edit or make changes on, and that would happen before the source actually gets published, before the final version that we read. So think of it too, if you're in a class, you may be working on an assignment, you may ask the other students in your class, can you read over my essay? Does this kind of make sense to you? Those are your peers. So that happens too when we talk about researchers and academic people as well. So peer reviewed. I don't know, Kathy, did you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that, sometimes when you're reading a guideline and when the instructor is telling you what sort of sources to use in your writing, they might call them peer-reviewed, they might call them scholarly. Are there other words, Vicki, that they might use? Refereed sources. Those are some of the words that they'll use to describe sources that have gone through this kind of careful scrutiny of peers that Vicki was talking about. So you can see the difference between peer-reviewed sources that have been reviewed by experts before they get published and, say, information on a basic website. Coral, is there anything else coming up in the chat?
Yes. Do you have to cite that background information that Vicki was talking about?
Vicki?
So it depends on a couple of things. One of the things that I always think about with background information is whether or not you're going to be using that in your assignment. If you're allowed to use some background information, then you would have to cite it. However, if it's just something to help you understand the topic better and you're really gathering all your main key points from the other sources, then you wouldn't have to cite those.
So I'm just going to add to that, and I'm going to sort of say it in other words, I guess, and also say for any piece of information that does show up in your paper that comes from a source, it has to be referenced. So if it does appear in your paper in the end, it should be referenced. Would you agree with that, Vicki?
Absolutely. Yeah, whatever sources you decide to use in the end. So if we're thinking back about that example assignment on climate change, although it's been said a minimum of 2 sources, if you end up reading and putting in maybe 3 or 4 sources, you need to cite all of those sources that you're using.
Anything else, Coral, in the chat for right now?
No, you guys are good to go on.
Okay, so let's talk about note-taking. Let's get really practical here. So this is taking notes while you're reading. It's an important step in the reading and writing process. It's really sometimes easy to bypass this step and skip it and not do it, but it's important. Your notes can become a bridge between the sources you're reading and the paper you're going to write. And I hope you're going to see how your notes can be a bridge as I talk about this a little bit. So the first step for effective note-taking is to be clear about the questions you need to answer in your paper. As we saw in yesterday's workshop, these questions come usually from your writing assignment. The next step is to be selective, including your notes, those ideas from the readings that will help you answer the assignment question. Leave out ideas that aren't relevant. This will help you, again, manage your time. If you're focused on the assignment question and you're selective in the notes you take, later when you review your notes, you'll find ideas that will become the main points of your paper. So instead of sifting through all your sources again, you'll have it all there in one document and you can just read and review that. As you work towards constructing your outline for your paper or your argument, you might also find that you have gaps in your knowledge. You might identify specific aspects that you need to address in your argument that you should probably go back and read about some more. This is really valuable, especially if your aim is to construct a really well-developed argument. On this slide, you don't have to read all the little words here. You can see 2 different ways of taking notes. The notes on the left of your screen are taken in bullet points, while the notes on the right are written out in full sentences. It doesn't really matter if you take notes as bullet points or write them out in full sentences. What's important is that over time, you develop a system of taking notes that works for you. And I bet if you talk to all of the writing tutors here and everybody who's involved in the writing process, we'd all have slightly, maybe even in big ways, different ways of keeping track of what we read and taking notes. So the following slides will give you some things to think about as you develop your system for note-taking. This is probably the most important point. We strongly encourage you to summarize or paraphrase when you take notes. When we paraphrase or summarize, we're putting ideas into our own words. It means not reading passively and copy-pasting from the original source into our notes. And in fact, copy-pasting is sometimes a way that students run into trouble. Rather, we're actively engaging with the ideas that we're reading about. We're digesting those ideas to such an extent that we can re-express them in our own way. If you come across an idea that you think will work really well in your paper, slow down in your reading, make sure you understand it, and then we suggest turn away from that text and try writing out the idea in your notes in your own words. Sometimes students feel like my words aren't as good as what the original author used, and it can feel like sort of intimidating to do that paraphrasing. Your instructor wants to read your way of expressing the idea, your interpretation of the idea. They're not interested in hearing that quote from the author. When you're paraphrasing, start linking the ideas you're reading about with the question you're answering in your paper. Write about how the idea connects to your question. If you can relate the idea in the reading to the question you're writing about, they'll start moving away from the wording in that original source to the way that you would express the idea. And when you put ideas into your own words in this way, you're actually already starting to write your draft, even in your notes. Let's look more closely at paraphrasing and summarizing. These are the paraphrases or summaries that could eventually land or be used in your final draft. It's really important for information that comes from your reading. If it moves into your paper, it's important to double check that the ideas have, in fact, been put into your own words. For paraphrases and summaries that you use in your final paper, be sure you have, and then let's go to the slide, be sure you have changed the words and sentence structure from the original reading. Be sure you've put quotation marks around any words or phrases that you haven't changed. Those belong to the original writer. They need to go into quotation marks to show they're not your words. And then be sure you've provided in-text citations and a full reference list at the end of your paper. These steps will ensure that you're writing with academic integrity. So if you are concerned about plagiarism, these steps help you to avoid any plagiarism in your writing. And again, at tomorrow's workshop, we'll talk more about that last step, providing in-text citations and a reference list. I want to show you now a sample paraphrase. This is a good example of paraphrasing, so you can see what a good paraphrase looks like. The quote at the top of this slide is from an article by Nicholas Emler. The article is called Several Moral Challenges of Leadership. The quote reads, "Doing good is the most difficult moral challenge for leadership and the challenge least often met." The paraphrase reads like this: "Effective leaders are concerned about using their position to improve conditions for others." Emler, 2019, states that this is one of the biggest challenges for leaders. That little Emler 2019 that you see in there in the paraphrase, that is a citation in APA style. And we'll look at that more tomorrow. What we want to look at now is the paraphrasing and the restructuring of the idea. So the paraphrase retains the original writer's idea that doing good is a major challenge for leaders. But the paraphrase also expresses that the idea completely restructures that idea of doing good. Let's look at how the paraphrase does that specifically. So instead of talking about leadership, as is talked about in the quote, the paraphrase talks about effective leaders. So it changes the wording. Also notice how the paraphrase restructures. In the paraphrase, the idea of effective leadership moves from the beginning, or moves from the middle of the original sentence to the beginning of the paraphrase. So we get some movement in how the idea is structured. Also note how the quote from Emler's article talks about doing good, while the paraphrase talks about improving conditions for others. So again, we see some rewording, and we see also that the whole sentence is restructured. Things are moved around and turned around. You can also see that in the paraphrase, we have two sentences instead of one sentence. So again, that's an indication that the whole idea has been restructured. So the idea is the same, the wording is different. Just a couple of tips for paraphrasing. We're going to look at a couple more examples in a minute of some paraphrases, and you're going to evaluate whether they have been paraphrased effectively. But just to sort of summarize at this point, some tips for paraphrasing. When you don't understand an idea but think it's important for your paper, find the background information. Make sure you understand the idea. It's really difficult, almost impossible to paraphrase if you haven't understood. Keep your assignment question at the front of your mind. If you start answering your assignment question while you're taking notes, you'll begin to reword ideas from your sources and you'll begin to reword them in a way that's going to fit with your paper. And then really importantly, after paraphrasing, check back to the original source and make sure you've changed the words and sentence structure. This is especially important for any paraphrases that land up in the final draft of your paper that you submit. Couple of last thoughts on note-taking, some really practical tips to incorporate as you develop your own system of note-taking. Always be sure to note down at the top of your notes the name of the source or the name of the author of the source so that you remember where the specific bits of information in your notes come from. Always track page numbers for each idea you take. If you're going to use an idea in your paper, you'll probably want to go back into that source and review that idea in a little bit more detail. And you'll also want to be sure, if you use it in your paper, that you have done the paraphrasing. And then last, and again, if you do include words that come from the original source, make sure you put them in quotation marks in your notes. So let's just do a little bit of practice here. So what I'm going to show you is another sentence from the Emler article, actually. It's a quote from that article, and then I'm going to show you a paraphrase. And we will run a poll to see if you think this paraphrase is an effective paraphrase or not. So first of all, here's the quote. Good leadership, therefore, requires extraordinary moral qualities. Bad leadership, lacking these qualities, can do immense damage. So that's the way Emler expressed this idea about good leadership and bad leadership. Now let's look at a paraphrase. Effective leadership requires extraordinary qualities, and bad leadership can do immense damage. Is this an effective paraphrase? Yes or no? We'll give it a few more seconds. We'll see what you said. Have the words been changed enough and the main idea retained? Okay, let's look at our poll results. So, the majority of you said no, the paraphrase is too close to the original wording. That is right. If we go back to the slide, yeah, we see good leadership has become just effective leadership. Still in the first position in the sentence. We see extraordinary moral qualities. That wording has been really retained in the paraphrase. This one word dropped. And then we see that final phrasing about immense damage still comes through in the paraphrase. Let's look at one more, and we'll run another poll. Actually, we're going to do two more. Here's the paraphrase. To be a good leader requires good character. Bad leaders can do a lot of damage. Is that an effective paraphrase? We'll just give it a few more seconds, see what you think. This one is a little bit tricky. The wording is further away from the wording in that original source. Okay, let's publish those poll results. 41% people thought, yep, words and sentence structure have been changed enough. And some people still think, no, it hasn't been changed enough. In fact, the wording is still too close to that original source. Notice how the wording, the sentence structure in the paraphrase really mirrors the sentence structure used in the original. It's like the person who wrote this paraphrase was looking back at the original source and just sort of changing a few things. They weren't really thinking about the idea, digesting the idea, and writing it out in their own way. Let's look at one more sample paraphrase. Here it is. Since leaders without a solid moral character can do harm, it is critical that today's leaders have a solid moral character. Let's see what you think. Is this a good paraphrase? Thanks so much, everyone, for taking a look at these paraphrases and answering the poll. This one is almost ready to be published. So almost everybody said, yeah, the words and sentence structure have been changed enough. And in fact, yes. This is the one that would be considered an adequate, a good paraphrase of the idea in that original source. The sentence structure is different, ideas have been moved around, and the wording has been changed. So this writer, the person who wrote this paraphrase, has clearly thought about the idea and digested it and re-expressed it in their own way. Coral, is there anything coming from the chat that we should talk about before we get to resources?
Yes. So a bit more questioning came back up about background information that I don't want to get lost because it was a very good question. With what if I don't use a specific bit of information in the paper, so I don't need an in-text citation, but I really feel like the background information I used influenced my thinking on this. How would I do that?
Oh, that is a fabulous question. Vicki, do you want to address it?
I'll let you start and see if I have any points to add.
Okay. The first thing that comes to mind is I would wonder, how did it influence you? So if it influenced the way you construct your argument, like if it sort of gave you your argument, yes, it needs to be acknowledged. So it's underlying your paper, right? It's underlying the structure of your thinking. So some way I would explicitly work into the paper acknowledging that the basis for my argument comes from this source. So it really depends to what extent. If it is only giving you background information to help you understand a concept, so kind of basic understanding, and then you're writing about that concept at a higher level. You're not explaining it, you're not using that source to explain what it is, but you're using that understanding to apply. I don't think it necessarily has to be acknowledged, but I think this is a great question to bring to your professor, actually, in the specific context of what you're writing. I think that's where my answer kind of goes to. This is a great question to bring to your instructor during office hours. Vicki?
Yeah, I agree with Kathy completely. It's often good to clarify with your instructor or professor about what their expectations are, especially when it comes to using some information, because they are the ones ultimately marking those assignments.
Mm-hmm.
So being very clear about how they would like you to use certain resources, or if certain resources are not even permitted. Sometimes you may see in the guidelines certain resources not being permitted. But when it comes to background information, it is very tricky, for sure. And that is very much one of these gray areas that is a very fine balancing act.
Yeah, so, I'll say for myself as an instructor when I'm teaching a course, I love it when students ask me those questions. My courses tend to be a smaller size, so I don't have, hundreds of students in my class, so I can look at small chunks of writing for students. So it is something that you could bring to your instructor during office hours. Coral, is there anything else?
Yes, we were also getting questions about the ratio of using direct quotes to paraphrases, and does this depend on the type of paper you're writing or what department or field you're in?
Oh, yeah, another excellent question. Thank you so much for asking that. Yes, you'll find in certain papers like, for example, English papers, where you'll use short quotes from the text that you're working with that sort of demonstrate your point. So in a paper like that, yes, use short quotes as evidence to show your point. In some other courses that I've been in where I've worked with instructors, they said, no, I don't want quotes in your paper. I want to see students paraphrasing the idea because it shows, it demonstrates that the student has understood the ideas in the reading. So I would say as a kind of a general response to that question that you'll be asked to paraphrase far more than quote. Would anyone else like to jump in on that?
I'll just add, in the sciences, they are strongly paraphrasing. Very few quotes are being used. And one of the ways to gauge whether or not that discipline uses more paraphrasing or allows quotes, when you're reading those sources, take a look to see if there are quotes being used in those texts or if they have summarized or paraphrased. That gives you a good sense about what that area really expects, because those are researchers and other people, professionals in that area. They know what the norms for writing is for those disciplines.
And again, ask your professors. This is a great question to ask. And when I do workshops in courses, say, for example, in management and elsewhere, it often comes up in class as a student question. It's a great one. Other students always really appreciate it when someone asks it. Anything else, Coral?
We are getting a lot of questions on resources coming up, so it might be a good time to transition. But I do just want to shout out everyone in the chat that had put in some of their own paraphrases to that quote earlier on. Good job, guys. It's really nice to see you applying what we've been learning in this workshop already, and some of that feedback that's coming between the groups about what was done well with those.
Oh, thank you so much for mentioning that, Coral, and that's really excellent that some of you have gone that extra step. Really good to hear. Vicki, let's pass you the ball on resources.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm unmuted. Okay, just checking. So finally, we wanted to share a few resources with you. These are linked, and so our slides will be added to the Learn course where you attended our session, so you can access the resources that way. In terms of booking an appointment with a tutor, Natalie covered appointment booking on Tuesday in detail, and this will be also reviewed again at tomorrow's writing workshop. Like writing tutors, you can also book appointments with librarians, but instead of writing, they will help you at any stage of your research. So this research can involve finding the appropriate sources to support your readings. That may be background, that may be scholarly, articles, peer-reviewed. So finding sources to use when you're writing. So we also cover organizing and keeping track of your sources, citing your work, and more. So even basic questions about library services, do I need a library clerk, can be asked at any time. The best way to get help from and research help is to book an appointment with a subject librarian or use the library's online chat. So we will look at those examples on the next slide, please. So here is the library's webpage. This is probably one of the most important ones as you go through your studies. So for every subject area, there is a specific librarian to help students in that particular area of study. So this is a librarian who knows a lot about those specific courses in that department, faculty, the types of assignments students would get there, and have a really good idea of how to best support students in that discipline. So Sarah, who's not with us today, is a subject librarian for U1, meaning she is good to talk to about Arts 1110. But if you are in elective or already know your major, you can use the list to help find the best person for that subject area. You can often meet with them via video chat. We're not doing in person right now, or you can communicate via email or phone with them. The other thing we want to highlight here is Ask Us. So it's a library's chat service. This is staffed with real people. There are no computer automated answers. These are real people answering your questions, and it's completely anonymous, and you can get fast answers in real time. So this is a great option for some very quick questions, or if you're having difficulties accessing a certain source that you've been able to find through the library. Another thing I'll just point out is right beside that contact your librarian, there's Find Study Spaces. So as of August 17th, 2 libraries have reopened, the Elizabeth Dafoe Library and the Sciences and Technology Library. So Elizabeth Dafoe Library and the Science Library are now open as individual quiet study space. So if you wanted to use the Dafoe Library, you would have to show your student card and you could go and sit there. Physical distancing is applying, and as most of you will know, if you come onto the Fort Garry campus, masks are now required. The Science Library, however, you can book in advance. And so with that booking, if you use that Find Study Spaces link, it will take you to where you would be able to click on another link to book the space for a day. Both of these libraries are open Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., and I'm happy to answer more questions, general questions you may have about the libraries.
Okay.
So this takes us perfectly into getting to the end, so back to Kathy.
Thanks so much, Vicki. We're now going to end recording this session, and we'll move